in the terrorist attack.
As we've just been talking about, the government has been negotiating with the crossbenchers to secure support for their legislation to cut company tax. Now, earlier in the week, Senator Darren Hinch said that he'd support the bill if banks were exempt from the cut.
In response, Liberal Democrat Senator David Leyonhjelm threatened to withdraw support for the cuts. Darren Hinch later backed away from his position, and Finance Minister Matthias Cormann confirmed that banks would not be excluded. For more on this and other political stories of the week, we're speaking now with Liberal Democrat David Leyonhjelm. Thanks so much for coming in. We'll get to the tax cuts in just a moment, but I want to start in Tasmania with the proposed weakening of the gun laws there. What do you make of that?
It's not really much of a weakening. What they're talking about is, so farmers are already allowed to use certain types of firearms. What they've proposed is that the workers who work on those farms can also use those sorts of firearms. It makes an awful lot of sense. If a farmer has to destroy stock or kill feral animals on their farm, then why can't someone who works for that farmer be able to do the same thing? That's the logic behind it. There's not really much of a weakening involved in this.
But it does allow greater access to self-loading rifles and pump-action shotguns. Bill Shorten has written to the Prime Minister saying he's concerned that essentially this goes against or doesn't comply with the National Firearms Agreement.
Well, number one, the National Firearms Agreement has no legal basis. It's just an agreement between the states. Bill Shorten can huff and puff all he likes about it. At the end of the day, if a state decides they don't want to cooperate with the National Firearms Agreement, that's up to them. But the other thing is, everybody who has a firearm, and there's about 1 million of us, I think, in Australia, plus all their families and so on, know this is a confected story. It has nothing to do with safety. And Bill Shorten has just alienated millions, probably, of retirees and pensioners and part pensioners over his dividend imputation. If he's now looking to alienate 1 million or more shooters and their families who know this is a load of nonsense, this is electoral suicide stuff.
But hang on, are you saying that those 1 million or so people that you say have a gun want self-loading rifles and pump-action shotguns?
No. What they know is that this is ridiculous, that there's not a weakening of the gun laws. New Zealand doesn't even have registration of shotguns and rifles. They still have pump actions, lever actions, semi-automatics and so on. They don't, no one runs around saying, oh, New Zealand's about to have something drastic happen. It's nonsense.
In Tasmania, Will Hodgman didn't release these plans in the election campaign. He released them just before polling day. Does that seem a little bit sneaky, given the history in Tasmania?
Well, I don't think the history in Tasmania has got anything to do with it, but is it a little bit sneaky? I thought it was fairly good politics. At the end of the day, firearm owners will vote according to that issue. All the people who don't like guns, who jump up and down about gun laws being too weak and wanting more controls and so on, they don't vote the issue. In fact, the bulk of them vote for the Greens already.
How could they, if it wasn't released until just before polling day? They didn't know. True
enough, yes, I suppose that's true. But, I'm not sort of trying to explain Will Hodgman's tactics, but I thought it made sense that the people who mattered, the people who are voting on that issue, who are prepared to vote on the issue, are the firearms owners, the licensees, and they needed to know. The rest of the country, the rest of the state, they wouldn't change their vote because of it anyway. That's the history of gun politics.
Senator, let's move on to corporate tax cuts. Would you accept any concessions by the government to get this up?
Well, I have already. Pauline Hanson's vote was acquired at a cost of, what is it, 50 million or something in apprenticeships. I understand there's a relatively small cost, but some cost involved in getting Steve Martin's vote across the line. I think the big picture here is to get the company tax reduced. Australia's uncompetitive. It's not going to increase the number of jobs and investment in Australia. It's just going to protect what we've got, just lowering the tax rate. So it's such a big issue that if we have to pay a small price to get us there, I think it's legitimate.
You would have chatted to your fellow crossbenchers. Do you feel as though it's very close? Do they feel as though that's just a little, maybe a bit more enticement and they'll get there?
The one person I'm not sure about is Tim Storer, who's the former NXT guy from South Australia. I don't know him well enough to know his thinking. But yes, I know the way Darren approaches these things. I'm pretty sure he'll get across the line. What I don't understand is why the two NXT guys, the existing guys there, are so opposed to reducing company tax. They both have a business background, and it's hard to explain why they don't understand the logic of it. But yes, if anyone can get it across the line, Matthias Cormann can. He's really very, very good at dealing with the crossbench, and I know he's very, very close.
Can big business be trusted to pass on this tax cut if it goes through?
Pass it on.
As in, will workers end up benefiting from this, or will it just be the big businesses?
Well, look, businesses don't pay people for more just because they happen to be there. They pay more when they're making more money, when they are increasing their profits, as I said, when their productivity goes up, when their labour force is more effective. So there's no, tax cut today, pay rise tomorrow. I know that happened in America, but that was mostly symbolic stuff. The idea of the tax cuts is so that companies have less of their money that they have to hand over to the government, and more of it that they keep for themselves, and they can use that for handing out to their shareholders as dividends, and bearing in mind that overwhelmingly the shareholders are Australians, and they retain some of their earnings, and some companies don't pay dividends at all, they retain all their earnings to invest in the future of their business. So they might expand, they might put on new products, they might open new premises, they might invest offshore and increase their profits that they're making in Australia. There's all sorts of ways in which their workers can benefit. But it's an oversimplification. Now, if a company is profitable, growing, expanding, needs skilled people, they're going to pay more for those people. So, but it's an oversimplification today to say today tax cuts, tomorrow wage rises.
Senator, you've been very vocal in comments made by Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton in reference to white South African farmers. He wants to bring those people here because he feels as though, many of them are suffering and perhaps being murdered. What right does Australia have to offer advice to a foreign government such as South Africa in regards to its land reform program?
Well, Australia offers advice to all sorts of countries to sort of clean up their act when it comes to human rights, and this is an instance where I think it ought to do that. I lived in South Africa for a little while during the apartheid era. It was terrible, absolutely terrible, and I hate racism in all its forms. And what we're seeing in South Africa now is racism. The reason white farmers are being killed and driven off their land is because they're white. That's racism. You don't need to get too nuanced about it. And the South African government has a constitutional bar on that sort of thing, but they're ignoring their own constitution. It would be, I think, very helpful if Australia was to say to the South African government, we know what you're doing, it's racism, don't pretend you can get away with it. Your predecessors, when the white government was in power and was racist against the blacks, suffered sanctions and things like that. It wouldn't be, I don't think at all unreasonable to remind them that what can happen when you have racist policies.
How do you justify that as far as you say it's racism, but you look at South Africa, some 3/4 of all land is owned by white people who make up less than 10% of the population. Clearly that's an issue that needs addressing.
Well, if that's the case, you don't steal it from them and kill them and drive them off their farms. If the government wants to have a policy of redistributing land, there's a legal proper way to do it. Those farmers didn't steal that land. There's no suggestion that they stole that land. So they bought it legitimately. So if the government says, well, we want more black farmers, well, fine, buy it from them and then sell it to the black farmers. What happened in Zimbabwe, though, was they stole it from the white farmers in Zimbabwe, and the cronies of the political elites took over those farms. They didn't even know how to farm. Zimbabwe is now a net importer, a major net importer of food, whereas once it was an exporter of food. It's just tragic what's happened to their agriculture sector. that's how it's going to go in South Africa if they don't stop this tendency.
You've suggested that these farmers, if they were brought here, would integrate more easily. Should our refugee intake be based on need rather than the ability of the refugees to integrate?
No, not entirely. Need is very important, and I'm actually quite a supporter of our humanitarian intake, our refugee intake. When I was negotiating with the government over the temporary protection visas, I convinced Scott Morrison, who was then the immigration minister, that we should increase our intake. What I like to think of is that our humanitarian intake is for people who are being persecuted and have got nowhere else to go. And that, for example, applied to the Christians in Syria. They have nowhere else to go.
Well, the same argument applies to Rohingya Muslims as well.
Yeah, and
the question is, are we giving preferential treatment to one group of people?
Well, the Rohingya can go to Bangladesh. It may be unsatisfactory, but there are other countries which accept Muslim immigrants. There are no other countries which would accept Syrian Christians, not within their vicinity. So Canada, the United States and Australia were the countries that took them. The Yazidis similarly had very few places to go. So I think white South Africans being driven out of their country because they are white, they've got very few places to go, and Australia is one of them.
Senator, we are at an end. We've run out of time, but I know you're not a sports fan, but do you have any comment to make just as far as those ball tampering allegations are concerned? Well, in fact, the Australians have admitted to ball tampering.
Yeah. No, I'm not a sports fan, but just imagine if it was a politician fiddling with their expenses, everyone would be howling for them to resign. It seems to me that this might be somewhat similar.
Right, David Leyonhjelm, thanks so much for coming in.
My pleasure.